Granite County, Montana Territory, January 1889. The storm had no name yet. It will be given one later in the newspapers that arrived by stage from Helena in the formal reports filed by surveyors and county officials who would count the dead and tally the livestock lost and try to reduce the catastrophe to numbers on a page. But in the moment of its arrival, it needed no name. It was simply the end of the world arriving from the north with the sound of something ancient and indifferent and vast. The sky dropped like a curtain cut from its rings. One moment there was a gray afternoon cold but familiar. The kind of January cold that a person who had lived through a Montana winter could negotiate, could move through, could survive. And then in the space of minutes, the temperature fell, not by degrees but by decades, plummeting with a violence that felt personal, that felt like the land itself had finally decided to rid itself of the small, stubborn creatures who had dared to settle upon it. The wind came next. It came from the north, and it was not wind in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a pressure, a force, a solid and relentless thing that hit the side of a building the way a river hits a stone continuously, without mercy, without pause. It drove the snow not downward but sideways, turning the air itself into a white and blinding wall that erased every landmark, every fence line, every familiar shape of the land that a person relied upon to know where they were in the world. Visibility dropped to 0 in 3 minutes. Men who had stepped outside to check on their horses and had left their front doors open were found the next morning, frozen within 50 yards of their own homes turned around, in the white blindness unable to find their way back to the light they had left burning in the window. This was the children's blizzard. This was the test that the winter of 1888 had been building toward the final and decisive examination of every choice that every settler in the Granite County Valley had made in the long months of preparation that had come before it. Inside the main house of the Callaway Ranch, a battle was already underway. Gideon Callaway was the most substantial man in the valley. That was the word people used. Substantial. It meant that his ranch ran 400 head of cattle. It meant that his house had 2 full stories and a stone chimney that rose 15 feet above the roofline. It meant that his woodpile stacked against the sheltered east wall of his house in a structure almost as large as some men's entire homes represented 2 full summers of cutting and hauling and splitting a monument in seasoned hardwood to the virtue of preparation. Substantial meant that Gideon Callaway was a man who did things right. And yet, inside that 2-story house with its thick log walls and its great stone fireplace that burned with a roar you could hear across the room, Callaway's wife, Harriet, had gathered their 2 children to her on the rug in front of the hearth, and she had wrapped every blanket they owned around all 3 of them, and still the cold was winning. The fireplace consumed wood with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. Callaway fed it continuously, log after log, watching the flames rise and dance and throw their light across the room in a warm and cheerful lie. Because the warmth barely reached 4 feet from the hearth. Beyond that, the room was a different country. A mug of water left on the table along the far wall had grown a crust of ice on its surface within an hour. The cold came through the floorboards in a slow and relentless upward pressure, a seeping invasion that no fire could entirely repel. It came around the window frames in thin white tendrils of snow that built tiny drifts on the interior sills. It came through the walls themselves, through every infinitesimal gap in the joinery drawn inward by the powerful updraft of the great chimney that was sucking the warm air of the room upward and away into the killing sky outside. The more fiercely the fire burned, the more cold air it drew in to replace the warm air it consumed. Calloway knew his cattle were in the barn. He knew they were 150 feet away across the yard. He knew with the cold and certain knowledge of a man who had raised cattle his entire life that they were dying. The water in their troughs would have frozen solid within the first hour of the storm. Their body heat, which on an ordinary cold night was sufficient to keep a well-built barn above the danger point, was not enough against this. Not against a temperature that had dropped to 30 below and was still falling. 150 feet. It might as well have been a mile. It might as well have been the surface of the moon. He had tried it once in the first hours of the storm. He had bundled himself in every layer he owned, had tied a rope to the door handle, and carried the coil with him, intending to use it as a lifeline. He had made it perhaps 20 feet before the wind hit him with a force that staggered him, before the cold found every gap in his clothing and drove into him like needles, before the white blindness swallowed the rope in his hands and the cabin door behind him, and every reference point he had ever possessed. He had turned back. He had stood in his doorway, gasping, his beard frozen solid, his fingertips gone white with the beginning of frostbite, and he had looked at his wife and his children huddled by the fire, and he had understood that he was helpless. That all of it, the stone chimney, the stacked wood, the thick walls, the 400 head of cattle, the entire edifice of his life's work and his considerable reputation as a man who did things right, none of it was enough. He thought in that moment about the woman. He pushed the thought away and went to feed the fire. Now shift. Turn away from that house with its roaring fireplace and its slowly losing battle. Turn away from the fear on the face of the most substantial man in Granite County. Let the wind carry you across the valley floor, through the white blindness and the killing cold, to a smaller place, a more modest place, a cabin that any reasonable observer would have described as the more precarious shelter, the less likely refuge, the place you would not choose to be caught in a storm of this magnitude. Turn and look. Inside of the cabin of Marin Halverson, a single candle burned. Not a roaring fire, a candle. Its flame stood perfectly still in the air of the room, straight and unwavering, burning with the quiet confidence of a flame that had no reason to fear the wind, because the wind was not here. The wind was outside, a distant and muffled roar. The sound of a beast that had been shut out, contained, denied entry. The sound was real, but it was remote, the way a storm sounds when you hear it from the bottom of a deep sheltered valley. Present but not threatening. Known but not dangerous. The room was not warm in the way that Calloway's room with its great fire aspired to be warm. It was not hot. It was not toasty. But it was a steady, even, pervasive temperature throughout, the same in the corner by the window, as it was near the small iron stove, which held a single modest log. that had been burning for 2 hours and would burn for 2 more. There were no drifts of snow on the interior sills. There were no tendrils of cold air curling in from the gaps around the door. The air was still. Oscar Halvorson was 6 years old, and he was lying on his stomach on the wooden floor with his chin propped on his hands, moving a small carved wooden soldier across an imaginary battlefield that existed only in his mind. His cheeks were not pale and pinched. His small hands were not tucked into his armpits for warmth. He was simply a boy on a floor playing in a room that was livable. That was the word for it. Not luxurious, not comfortable in any way that Gideon Calloway would have recognized as comfort, but livable, endurable, safe. His mother, Maren Halvorson, stood at the small table near the stove. She was pouring warm milk from a pot into a tin cup. The milk steamed gently in the still air of the cabin. She had gone to get it not 30 minutes ago. And when she had gone, she had not pulled on 3 layers of wool and a heavy coat, and wound a scarf around her face until only her eyes were visible. She had put on a shawl. She had picked up a lantern. She had opened a door in the floor of the root cellar, and she had walked in near silence 100 feet through the earth, and she had emerged in the warm and earthy darkness of the barn, where Blossom the cow had turned her wide brown head and blinked slowly, as if mildly surprised but not at all alarmed by the visit. She had done her chores in the barn with an unhurried efficiency that felt, in the context of the catastrophe howling outside, almost indecent in its normalcy. She had checked on the 2 goats. She had confirmed the chickens were roosting peacefully. She had broken the thin skim of ice on the surface of the water trough with a single tap of a stick, because it was only a skim. Only the lightest possible suggestion of ice, because the barn was above freezing, because the animals themselves were warm, and their warmth was captured and held in the sealed and earthen space that surrounded them. She had milked the cow. She had come home. She set the tin cup of warm milk on the floor beside her son. He picked it up without looking away from his soldiers and drank. Outside, the blizzard that would be called the worst in 30 years was completing its opening act. Maren sat down in the chair by the small stove and looked at the candle flame, which was still perfectly still. And she thought about a summer evening in August 5 months ago, when she had sat in this same chair, with the warm night pressing softly against the windows, and had opened a wooden chest that smelled of pine and ink and the man she had lost, and had read words that had changed the shape of the world for her. She thought about how none of it had come easily. Not the idea, not the work, not the endurance of the doubt and the mockery that had been poured on her in the months between that evening and this one. She thought about a man on a horse who had looked down at her from a great height and told her she was digging her own grave. And she looked at her son, drinking his warm milk on the floor of their living, breathing, sheltered cabin, while the worst storm in 30 years tried and failed to get inside. And she felt something that was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was more durable. It was the deep and settled satisfaction of a person who had looked at the truth of something, believed in it against all pressure, and been proven right, not by argument, but by the irrefutable testimony of reality itself. This is a story about how she got there, This is the story of the woman nobody bet on, and the tunnel she dug alone, and the winter that proved her right, in a way that no amount of reasonable conversation ever could have. Go back. Go back 5 months. Go back to August of 1888, when the air was warm and golden and full of the lazy hum of late summer insects, when the mountains to the west caught the afternoon light and held it burning amber against the blue sky, when it was possible for a person who was new to this land to look at the world and believe that it was benevolent. Maren Halvorson was not new to this land. She had arrived in Granite County, Montana Territory 6 years before, with her husband Edvard, newly married, sailing from a small coastal town in Norway with a chest full of books and a head full of ideas, and a particular kind of practical optimism that was native to people who had grown up in landscapes that were also beautiful, and also dangerous, and also entirely indifferent to human suffering if you were careless enough to misread them. Edvard Halvorson had been, by the formal accounting of his neighbors, a miner. He worked the East Mine as most of the men in the area did, and he was good at it, reliable and skilled and unhurried in the way of a man who understood that the earth was patient and required patience in return. But that accounting missed most of who Edvard actually was, the way that most formal accountings of people miss most of who they actually are. What Edvard was in the accounting that mattered was a student of the earth. He had grown up reading everything he could find about geology, about the way that pressure moved through rock, about the way that water found its path, about the way that temperature behaved at different depths, the strange and counterintuitive ways that the planet managed its own heat. He read in Norwegian and in the careful, halting English he had taught himself from borrowed books. He filled journals with diagrams and calculations and observations that bore no direct relationship to his daily work in the mine, but that satisfied something in him, some deep need to understand the system he was moving through, rather than merely to operate within it. He had ideas. He had plans. He had sketches in the backs of those journals drawn in the evenings at the kitchen table, while Maren read beside him, and Oscar was not yet born or was very small. Sketches of houses that were built differently, that used the earth rather than resisted it, that thought about heat, the way an engineer thinks about water, as something to be directed and managed and conserved rather than generated in vast quantities and immediately lost. He had been killed in a rockfall in the East Mine on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1887. It was a geological event, a sudden and catastrophic shift in the pressure along a fault line that the miners had identified and marked and been careful around for years. And that had moved anyway because the earth has its own schedule and does not consult the schedules of the men working within it. Edvard and 2 other men were gone before anyone had time to understand what was happening. Maren was left with a 30-acre claim of land that was more rock than soil, a cabin that was drafty but sound, a 6-year-old boy, a small chest of books and journals filled with her husband's meticulous handwriting, and a single milk cow named Blossom, 2 goats with difficult personalities and useful milk, and half a dozen chickens who treated the concept of cooperation as a personal insult. These animals were not property. They were her partners in survival. They were the difference between making it through the winter and not making it through the winter. Their milk was protein and fat and vitamins in the months when nothing grew. Their eggs were a small daily miracle. Blossom alone, properly tended, could provide more nutrition per day than Marin could otherwise purchase with a week's worth of cash money, of which she had very little. The first winter after Edvard died had been a preview. Not the worst winter, not by the reckoning of the old-timers who had been in the territory since before the homesteaders arrived. Just a normal, hard Montana winter. The kind that the valley handled as a matter of course. But normal hard was sufficient to nearly kill them. The blizzards arrived in November and did not fully release their grip until March. And in that time, Marin had made the journey between her cabin and her barn multiple times a day, every day through conditions that ranged from brutal to nearly unsurvivable. She had strung a rope between the two buildings, a technique she had been advised to use, and on the worst days, she made the 100-foot crossing hand over hand. Her eyes squeezed shut against the wind and the blowing snow. Unable to see the barn even from 10 feet away, following the rope by feel. Alone, her body so bundled in layers that she could barely move her arms, the cold finding the edge of every scarf, the gap behind every collar, the thin spot in every glove, seeking entrance, the way water seeks a crack. She had made it. Every time she had made it. But Blossom had gotten sick. The cow had developed a lung fever from the repeated exposures to the killing cold during the times between Marin's visits during the long nights, when the temperature in the barn dropped dangerously, when the straw bedding and the animal's own body heat were not quite sufficient, and the cold came through the barn walls with a slow and patient authority. Marin had spent 3 nights sleeping in the barn, wrapped in every blanket she could carry, waking every 2 hours to check the cows' breathing, mixing warm mashes of grain and offering them by lantern light in the darkness while Oscar slept alone in the cabin 50 yards away. Blossom had survived. Marin had carried the memory of those nights in her body all through the following spring and summer. A cold knot of knowledge that she could not unknow. The knowledge that they had been lucky. The knowledge that luck was not a strategy. The knowledge that the next winter might be harder, or that Blossom might not recover a second time, or that Marin herself might not make it back along the rope one day, and what would happen to Oscar then. She had spent the spring thinking about this and had arrived at no solution that satisfied her. The conventional answers were all variations of the same answer: do more of what you are already doing, but do it better and harder and with more wood cut and more rope strung and more layers of clothing and more everything. Work harder. Endure more. Hope the animals survive. Hope you survive. Hope was not a strategy either. The summer passed. The garden was planted and tended and harvested with the focused efficiency of someone who has no time to waste, because they genuinely have no time to waste. Wood was cut. Water was hauled. The small daily arithmetic of homestead survival was performed without drama, because drama was a luxury that required an audience, and Marin had no audience. And then it was late August, and it was evening, and Oscar was asleep, and the warm night pressed its soft face against the window glass, and Marin sat in the chair by the cold stove and looked at the wooden chest in the corner. She had not opened it since the week after Edvard was buried. The grief of that first opening had been a physical thing, a weight that sat on her chest and made breathing difficult, and she had closed the chest and left it and focused on the immediate and unending work of survival. Because the work did not care about grief, and neither did the winter. But she opened it now. It smelled of him, pine resin and lamp oil, and the particular smell of paper that has been written on by a specific hand for many years, a smell that is both generic and completely individual the way a voice is. She ran her fingers along the spines of the journals, his handwriting on the labels, the dates, the years of their life here documented in his careful, angular script, the Norwegian words mixed with English technical terms and mathematical notation, and the occasional sketch that spilled out of the margin and across the entire page. She took out the most recent journal, the one from the year he died. She did not read it from the beginning. She turned to the back half, to the pages where his thinking had most recently lived, where his ideas had been most recently evolving. And she found the section she had, she now realized, been remembering without knowing she was remembering it. The section she had encountered once in the early days of their life here, when she had read over his shoulder on a quiet evening and asked him what he was drawing. He had explained it to her then. She had listened with the half attention of a person who is interested but not yet personally invested, who stores information without knowing yet that it will someday become necessary. She had listened and asked a few questions and gone back to her book, and the conversation had settled into the deep archive of her memory, where it had waited patient as the earth itself for the moment when she would need it. The sketch covered 2 full pages. It showed a house set into a hillside, not built upon the ground, but partially embedded in it, the roof sloping and covered in earth and grass, the walls going down rather than simply up. Below the main sketch were diagrams, cross-sections showing layers of earth at different depths, with annotations about temperature. And connecting the house to an outbuilding some distance away was a passage drawn in neat, parallel lines descending slightly below the frost line, lined with stone, covered with earth and sod. In the margin, in his careful hand, was a note. He had written it in Norwegian, as he always did when he was writing for himself, rather than for any potential reader. Maren had grown up speaking Norwegian. She read it the way you read in your mother tongue, without translating the words, arriving as meaning rather than as sounds. The earth does not forget the summer. She sat for a long time with the journal open in her lap. The earth does not forget the summer. Edvard had been fascinated by what happened to temperature underground. It was something he had experienced directly in the mines. The way the killing cold of a Montana winter simply could not reach you once you descended past a certain depth. The mine shafts, which might be expected to be freezing, were instead a steady, constant, unremarkable temperature year-round. Never warm, never comfortable in the way that a heated room is comfortable, but never below freezing, never the kind of cold that kills. He had measured it because Edvard measured things. He had noted in these journals that below approximately 4 feet of depth, the temperature of the earth in this part of Montana held at a consistent 45 to 50 degrees, regardless of the season. The surface might be frozen solid in January and baked in July, and it made no difference to the temperature at that depth. The Earth absorbed the variations of the surface and smoothed them into something stable and predictable, and compared to the extremes of a Montana winter, almost benign. Deep ground temperature was not warm, but it was not 30 below zero. And the gap between those two facts was the entire width of a life. The principle that Edvard had been working out in these pages was elegant in its simplicity. If you could move air through a passage that stayed at that constant depth, temperature, regardless of how cold it was outside the air that entered the passage at 30 below, would not emerge from the other end warm, but it would emerge far less cold. It would emerge preconditioned, the worst of its killing temperature, stripped away by the simple act of traveling through a medium that the frost could not reach. And it went further than that. The notes went further. The animals in the barn produced heat. A single cow, Edvard had calculated with citations from an agricultural text, produced the heat equivalent of a small stove, continuously, without requiring wood, without requiring maintenance, simply by existing and breathing and converting hay into body warmth in the ancient and efficient way that mammals have always done. In an open or drafty barn, this heat was immediately lost to the outside. But in a sealed system, a barn properly closed and connected to an underground passage, that heat could be captured. It would warm the air of the barn, and that warmed air, being less dense, would move slowly, and by convection through the underground passage toward the cabin. It would give up its heat to the stone walls of the passage as it went charging them like a battery. The stone would hold that heat and release it slowly, continuously into the air of the passage and the rooms connected to it. The animals would heat the tunnel. The tunnel would temper the cabin. The earth itself would prevent the system from ever dropping to a lethal temperature. No moving parts, no maintenance. No wood required beyond what was needed to cook and take the edge off the morning chill. The entire machine was powered by the breath of a cow and the patient, enormous thermal mass of the planet. Maren closed the journal and held it in both hands in the warm August night, and looked at the wall of the cabin and thought for a long time. She was not an engineer. She had not read the technical papers that Edvard had read, had not worked through the mathematics of thermal mass and heat calculations and convection coefficients. But she understood the principle the way a person who has spent years watching the natural world understands its principles, not as abstraction, but as pattern. She had seen how the root cellar stayed cold in summer and refused to freeze even in the deepest winter. She had felt how the temperature changed as she descended into it, the way the earth's patience manifested as a kind of stubborn moderation. She had lived on this land long enough to understand that it operated by different rules than the surface, that below the chaos of seasons there was something steady and reliable. She trusted Edvard's calculations because she had seen him calculate other things and be right. She trusted his diagrams because she had watched him draw them, and she knew how his mind worked. She trusted the idea not because she could independently verify it, but because it was consistent with everything she had observed about how the world actually behaved when you paid close enough attention. And the alternative was to do what she had done last winter, to endure and hope and make the 100-foot crossing on the rope again and again, and pray that Blossom survived and that she survived, and that Oscar was not left alone. She was not willing to do that again. The decision arrived not as a sudden resolution, but as the recognition of something that had already been decided, the way that a river finds a course, not by choosing among options, but by following the logic of the terrain. The terrain of her situation had been directing her toward this decision since the moment she had survived the first winter and understood how close it had been. She had simply not had the diagram in front of her yet. She would build it. The passage her husband had dreamed. She would dig a tunnel. She went to bed that night and she slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a person who has resolved a long uncertainty. The sleep of someone who knows what they have to do and has accepted the weight of it and is resting before they begin. In the morning, before Oscar woke, she walked the line between the cabin and the barn. She paced it, counting her steps, standing in the early light with the dew still heavy on the grass and the mountains showing pink and then gold against the pale sky. 103 feet. The ground was summer hard, baked by months of sun, studded with rocks of varying sizes in the way of this particular patch of earth, which had always been more generous with rocks than with soil. She would need to go down at least 4 feet. 5 would be better to get reliably below the frost line and into the stable thermal zone that Edvard's notes described. She would need the passage to be wide enough to walk through with a bucket in each hand. 3 feet, perhaps 3.5. She would need to line the walls and floor with flat stone, both for structural integrity and to maximize the thermal mass that would absorb and hold and slowly release the captured heat of the animals. She was a single woman with a shovel and a 6-year-old helper. The math of this, the sheer volume of earth to be moved and rock to be set, was not something she calculated precisely. She calculated it in the way that experienced manual laborers always calculate large tasks, not by arriving at a total number that might be paralyzing, but by establishing a daily pace that was sustainable and trusting that pace over time. She had seen Edvard do this in the mine. She had done it herself in the garden and the woodlot. You do not think about all the wood that needs to be cut. You think about this tree, and then the next one. She went to the root cellar, which was already dug, already partially lined with stone, a basic but serviceable underground room that kept her preserved vegetables and her smoked meat through the winter. This would be the starting point. She would extend it, deepening the floor to the correct level, and then driving forward through the earth toward the barn. A slow and patient and absolute process of making a new thing out of what was already there. She found the iron bar that Edvard had used for prying rocks. She found the 2 good shovels and the 1 broken-handled shovel that she had been meaning to repair for 6 months. She found the wheelbarrow. She went upstairs and made oatmeal for Oscar, and sat with him while he ate, and told him in the simple and direct language she used with him about everything, what she was gonna do and what his job would be in doing it. He was 6. He understood the important parts. His job would be to drag the small rocks away from the edge of the excavation in his little wooden cart. He would also be the person who went to look for flat stones in the creek bed, which was a task that appealed to him because it involved wading in the creek and throwing things. Like a cave, he asked because he was 6 and caves were interesting. Like a very long root cellar, Marin told him. Like a road underground. He thought about this. Can I bring my soldiers? After the work, she said. She drove the first stake into the ground that morning. She drove it at the point directly above where the root cellar ended, marking the beginning of the excavation that would carry forward from that point toward the barn. She drove a second stake at the far end at the foundation of the barn, where the passage would emerge into the earthen floor of the animal pen. She stretched twine between them, pulling it tight and checking it with her eye until it ran straight. She tied it off and stepped back and looked at the line she had drawn across the world. It looked, she had to admit, extremely modest. Twine on stakes across a dirt yard. The gap between ambition and reality viewed from the outside was almost comical. She picked up her shovel and went to work. The first day was an education. The ground resisted her with a specific and personal stubbornness as though it had been waiting for her and had prepared its defenses. The surface layer was sun-baked to a concrete hardness. Her shovel rang against it and bounced back. She switched to the iron bar, using it as a pick, breaking the surface into chunks that she could then lever up and remove. Progress was measured in inches that first morning, each one extracted by negotiation. By midday, she had a trench perhaps 8 feet long and 2 feet deep. Her hands were already staging a protest. The blisters that she expected were forming in the places where she expected them on the inside of her right palm, and across the pads of her left fingers where she gripped the iron bar. She wrapped them with strips of cloth and continued. Oscar was a more effective partner than she had expected. He had inherited apparently his father's methodical temperament. He approached the task of removing rocks with the same serious concentration that he applied to building structures with his wooden blocks. He filled his small cart, pulled it to the edge of the property where she had designated the spoil pile, emptied it with a theatrical dump that he seemed to find deeply satisfying, and returned. He did not complain about the heat or the repetitiveness. He occasionally stopped to examine a particularly interesting rock which she allowed, because it was important, she believed, for children to be interested in the natural world. She thought about Edvard a great deal during those first days. Not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, but with something more complex, a conversation she was having with him through the medium of his ideas. A dialogue conducted in the language of physical work and practical application. He had drawn these diagrams at this table in this cabin and believed in these principles, and she was now enacting them in the soil of the homestead they had come to together. There was a continuity in this that was not comfort exactly, but was something real and sustaining. She did not talk about the project to her neighbors in those first days, not from secrecy, but from the same practical instinct that keeps a person from announcing plans before they are certain of their ability to execute them. She had a habit trained by experience of doing things before discussing them, of letting the evidence of the work speak, rather than the words. But the work was visible. This was Montana in August. People moved around. People stopped by. People noticed. On the fourth day, Wendell Morse, who ran the feed mill at the edge of town, and whose route sometimes brought him past the Halverson place, stopped his wagon on the road and looked over the fence at the long, raw line of excavation in her yard. "Putting in a root cellar extension, Mrs. Halverson," he called. She was 4 feet down in the trench at the time, levering a medium-sized boulder out of the clay face in front of her. She looked up at him from below the level of the surrounding ground, squinting against the August sun. "Connecting it to the barn," she said. She went back to the boulder. There was a pause above her. "Connecting it. You mean a passage?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. She heard him shift in the wagon seat. "For what purpose, if you don't mind my asking?" She got the boulder free. It was heavier than it looked, and she had to get underneath it with the iron bar and use her entire body weight as a counterbalance, walking it up the inclined surface of the trench wall, inch by inch. Her arms shook with the effort. "For warmth," she said when she had enough breath to speak. "For the winter." Morse looked at the line of twine stakes stretching across the yard to the barn. She could not see his face from where she was, but she could hear him working out the mathematics of the project, arriving at the scope of it. "That's a considerable amount of digging, ma'am." "Yes." "You know a rope line between the buildings kept clear of snow after each storm would serve the same purpose. Takes about an afternoon to set up." She did not respond to this. She had a rope line. She had used the rope line last winter to cross the yard blind in the blizzard hand over hand, barely able to move in all her bundled layers, each crossing an ordeal that left her exhausted and chilled through. She knew what a rope line could do and could not do. Morse waited for her to say something. She did not. He chuckled a dry and fading sound and shook the reins. The wagon moved on. The story began to circulate. In the particular social ecology of a small frontier community, news of the unusual traveled fast and was processed, communally tested against established norms, and filed under the appropriate category. The category for what Maren Halverson was doing was not immediately apparent to her neighbors, which made it interesting and then concerning and then a subject of genuine debate. The first label was practical. People called it the Widow's Project or the Halverson Trench, naming it after the woman who was making it in the frontier habit of attaching a person's name to the thing they were most visibly occupied with. This was neutral. This was just description. Then the assessment began. The analysis was conducted in the way that small community analysis always is in the conversations between neighbors at the mill after church in the stores that served as social hubs. The conclusion that formed was not malicious. It was in many ways genuinely concerned. People looked at the scope of the project, at the amount of summertime being consumed by excavation, rather than the standard preparations of woodcutting and hunting and food preservation. And they worried. They worried that she was making a mistake that would cost her in the winter. They worried that the project was the kind of thing that grief does to a person. that it was Edvard's folly rather than her own that she was spending herself on a dead man's dream, when she should have been doing the proven practical things that kept people alive. The label that took hold somewhere in the third week of August was the widow's folly. She heard it indirectly the way you hear things about yourself in small communities in the slightly careful phrasing of a friendly neighbor who mentioned that people were a little worried in the silence that sometimes fell in a store when she walked in the way that certain people's greetings to her had acquired a note of pity that had not been there before. She did not stop digging, her hands calloused. The blisters that had formed in the first week dried and toughened into a new geography of skin that was better designed for the work. Her back, which had screamed its protest in the opening days, made its adjustments and found the new mechanics of the labor and incorporated them. She grew stronger in specific ways, the ways demanded by digging and lifting, and the constant lever work of moving large rocks in confined spaces. By the end of the first week, she had 40 feet of trench 3 feet deep, working toward the target depth of 5 feet. The stone collection was ahead of schedule because Oscar had become genuinely enthusiastic about identifying useful flat stones in the creek bed, and because the pasture clearing she had been doing for 2 years had already produced a substantial pile of fieldstone along the fence line that could be recruited for the lining. By the end of the second week, 60 feet and 4 feet deep in most sections, with the stone lining beginning to take shape in the oldest sections of the trench. The dry stacked walls rising with a careful precision that Edvard would have appreciated. The community's concern acquired a specific voice in the form of Gideon Calloway. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of September. The aspens up on the ridge above the valley had begun to turn a wash of gold, spreading down through the green like a warning, written in the language of seasons. The air had acquired its autumn edge, the particular sharp clarity that Montana air takes on when the warmth is still present. But the cold has announced its intention to return. Maren was in the trench when she heard the horse. She was 70 feet along the line, setting a large flat stone into the base of the west wall, working it back and forth into the clay floor to seat it properly. She was 4 feet below the surface. She heard the hoofbeats stop, and then nothing for a moment, and then the voice. "Mrs. Halverson." She looked up. Gideon Calloway sat on his horse at the edge of the excavation. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had been worked over by weather and years into something that conveyed authority even in repose. He wore a good coat and a good hat, and sat his horse with the unconscious ease of a man who has been on horseback more hours of his life than he has been off it. He did not dismount. This was, Maren understood immediately, a statement. He was looking down at her from a height, literally and in every other sense. He was the most prosperous rancher in the valley. His opinion was the closest thing the community had to official policy. He had 400 head of cattle and a house with 2 stories and a woodpile that people mentioned as an example of what proper preparation looked like. He had not come for a conversation. He had come to deliver a verdict. "Mr. Calloway," she said. She straightened up as much as the depth of the trench allowed, and shielded her eyes from the sun with the back of her arm. "I'll come to the point," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way that walls are firm. You are engaged in a project that this community believes and that I personally believe is a serious error in judgment. You are spending the last weeks of workable weather on an excavation that, by any practical measure, cannot be completed before winter, and will not perform the function you intend, even if it is completed. She waited. A widow and her child represent a responsibility to this community, he continued. We look out for our own, but we cannot look out for a person who will not exercise sound judgment in their own behalf. What you should be doing with these weeks is the work that every experienced homesteader in this valley is doing. Cutting wood, laying in stores, mending your roof and your barn walls. The rope line between your cabin and your barn is sufficient. It has served you before. She looked at him. She looked at the certainty in his face, the absolute conviction of a man who has built a successful life on a set of principles and has had those principles confirmed by years of results, and who cannot therefore conceive that the principles might be incomplete. She felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor. I have enough wood, Mr. Calloway, she said. Her voice was level. And this is also winter work. The work of winter is not only what you do in the cold, it is also what you build before the cold comes. He looked at the trench. He looked at the line of stakes still stretching to the barn. Something shifted briefly in his face. Not doubt, but a kind of impatience with her refusal to be persuaded. This is a hole in the ground, he said. It is not a winter preparation. It will fill with drifted snow. The damp will come up through the earthen walls into your cabin. It is, I tell you plainly, not the solution to the problem you think it solves. She set her palm against the flat stone she had just seated into the wall. It was cool to the touch with the deep and patient coolness of the earth at 4 feet of depth, a temperature that had nothing to do with the air temperature above, and everything to do with the vast and unhurried thermal arithmetic of the planet. She felt it against her palm and thought about Edvard's notes, about the numbers he had worked out, about the steady, stubborn truth of what she was touching. The cold lives in the ground, she said quietly, but so does the warmth. A thing that takes can also give back if you understand which direction to approach it from. Calloway stared at her. She could see in his face that he had heard the words, and they had arrived at a place in his mind that had no category for them, no existing framework into which to fit them. He was a practical man. His practicality was genuine, and it had served him and the people who relied on him for decades. But it was a practicality built on the surface of the world, on the things that were visible and countable and familiar. What she was describing lived below that surface. You are making a mistake, he said. His voice had cooled to something final. I've said what I came to say. The consequences are now yours to bear. He turned his horse and rode away. She watched him go. The sound of his horse faded into the golden September afternoon. Above her on the ridge, another section of aspen forest flared into yellow. She climbed down into the trench and picked up her shovel. The work continued. September deepened. The mornings began to carry genuine cold, the first real cold. The kind that leaves a white rime on the north sides of things, and hardens the mud along the creek edge. The aspen gold faded from the ridges and the trees went bare, and the mountains revealed themselves in their winter architecture, the high peaks gathering the first permanent snowcap of the season. Maren worked by lantern light in the mornings before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She worked through the middle of the day when the light was best, and the ground was slightly softened by whatever warmth the October sun could deliver. She worked in the evenings until it was too dark to see the face of the stone she was trying to seat. Her hands were no longer a problem. They had become the hands of the work remade by it. The calluses thick and reliable, the grip strong and precise. The stone setting had become a kind of fluency, the reading of each rock's shape and weight, and the finding of its proper place in the wall the way a person who has learned a language well finds the right word without searching for it. Oscar hauled rock. Oscar pulled the small wagon. Oscar sat in the long autumn evenings while she read to him from one of the few storybooks they owned. And in the evenings she also read when he was sleeping from Edvard's journals, working through the technical sections more carefully, now that the diagrams were becoming reality under her hands. Checking her work against his design, looking for errors in her implementation of his idea. She found a few places where she adjusted the angle of the passage to better direct airflow. She made the stone lining thicker than his original sketch had indicated, because she had more stone available than his diagram assumed. She built the passage wider in the sections near the barn to allow the warm, moisture-laden air from the animals more contact with the stone walls before it continued its journey toward the cabin. She was not copying his design. She was enacting it, adapting it to the specific conditions of the actual earth she was moving through, the actual stone she was working with, the actual distances involved. She was finishing the conversation he had begun in the margins of a journal on a winter evening years ago, and it occurred to her sometimes in the long physical silence of the work that this was not so different from what she had always done with Edvard. He had the ideas, and she had made them real. They had worked that way together, and she was working that way still. And the collaboration was not less real for the fact that one of its members was no longer present in his body. The first snow came on a morning in late October, a light and indecisive thing, 3 inches that lay on the ground for a day and melted in the afternoon sun. But it announced the approach of what was coming with the specificity of a formal notice. She had 4 sections of roof left to complete. She worked without stopping for the next 10 days. She laid the heavy timbers she had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding across the top of the completed sections, setting them at intervals that would support the weight of snow and earth above. On top of the timbers, she placed hides, water-resistant and flexible, creating a membrane that would prevent the earth above from filtering down through gaps in the wood. And then she and Oscar began the work of roofing, shoveling the excavated earth back onto the top of the passage, building it up in layers, compressing each layer before adding the next, creating a low, seamless mound that rose only slightly above the surrounding grade, the sleeping spine of some underground creature. She seeded the raw earth of the mound with handfuls of dried prairie grass, root pressing them in with her palm, trusting the late-season warmth to encourage them to take hold before the ground froze. They would not establish fully before winter, but they would hold enough to prevent the worst erosion. The second snow came in the first week of November. 6 inches this time and staying. She finished the last section of roof on the morning of that snowfall, working in falling snow, the white accumulating on her shoulders and her hair, packing the earth over the last timber with her hands, and then smoothing it flat with the back of the shovel. She set the final tuft of grass root into the mound. She stood up. She looked at the gentle swell of earth that now ran barely visible under the new snow from the back corner of the cabin to the foundation of the barn. From above, from any ordinary angle of observation, it looked like nothing. A low ridge in the yard, the kind of feature that might be produced by any number of mundane causes. It looked like nothing. It was in the accounting that mattered everything. She went inside and made tea and sat at the table and opened Edvard's journal to the page with the sketch and held the book in both hands and read the margin note one more time. The earth does not forget the summer. Outside, the snow continued to fall. November settled over the valley like a long breath released. The community of Granite County pulled itself inward, attending to fires and stores and the shortened days and the long cold nights, and largely forgot about the widow's folly, because there were more immediate concerns, and because the trench was now buried under snow and no longer visible as a provocation. No one saw her go down into the root cellar that first evening. No one saw her open the new door she had cut into the back wall of the cellar, the door that opened into the beginning of the tunnel. No one was there to see her pick up her lantern and step through into the passage that smelled of earth and stone and the cool, patient breath of the deep ground. She walked its length. She walked it in the light of the lantern, her footsteps quiet on the flat stone floor, the stone walls close on either side, the low timber roof just above her head. The air was cool and absolutely still. The lantern flame burned straight and true without a flicker. The temperature was the temperature of the earth at 4 feet of depth. That steady, unremarkable temperature, that was the earth's own memory of every summer it had ever known. She emerged in the barn. Blossom turned her head and blinked. The goats made their opinions known in the way of goats, which is to say, loudly and without any real content. The chickens ignored her. The barn was cold, but it was the cold of a space where large, warm-blooded animals had been living all day. A cold that was held in check by the continuous, effortless heat production of the cow and the goats. A cold that was not allowed to fall to the dangerous depths it had reached last winter, because now the heat had nowhere easy to escape, because the passage was a drain for that heat in the slow and thermally correct sense that it carried the warmth away at exactly the rate that preserved it, rather than losing it. She did her chores. She checked the water trough, which was not frozen. She milked the cow. She returned through the passage to the cabin, with the milk pail warm in her hands, and she climbed up into the root cellar, and then up into the kitchen, and put the milk on the stove, and called Oscar for dinner. He came to the table and ate his oatmeal and drank his heated milk and told her about the game he had been playing with his wooden soldiers while she was gone. A complicated campaign that involved a river made of a strip of blue cloth and a mountain range made of potatoes he had taken from the bin without asking. She did not scold him for the potatoes. She sat across from him at the table that Edvard had built in the cabin that Edvard had helped her build, eating the food that Blossom had helped provide, warmed by the heat that the earth had been holding since August, and was now slowly, patiently releasing. And she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. She felt prepared, not certain. Certainty about a Montana winter was not something a sensible person claimed, but prepared, ready, grounded in something more reliable than hope, more durable than luck, more intelligent than endurance. She had built a machine with no moving parts. She had built it with a shovel, and a 6-year-old assistant and her husband's ideas and her own 2 hands. All it needed now was a test. The winter of 1888 was already preparing to provide one. November came in soft, and then hardened. That is the way of Montana winters in the years when they intend to be serious. They do not announce themselves with immediate violence. They arrive the way a patient and experienced adversary arrives, quietly without drama, allowing you time to believe that perhaps this year will be manageable, that perhaps the warnings were overstated, that perhaps the preparations you made or failed to make will prove sufficient either way. The first 3 weeks of November were cold but navigable. The snow that had fallen in late October compacted and settled, and the ground accepted it with the indifference of something that has absorbed 10,000 winters before this one, and expects 10,000 more after. The creek slowed and thickened along its edges, but kept its center moving. The sky was clear more days than not, a high and brittle blue that held no warmth but at least admitted the light. The community of Granite County settled into its winter patterns. The men who had cattle brought their herds in from the higher pastures and confined them to the lower fields and the barns where the feeding could be managed through the months when the grass was gone. The women who had gardens put up the last of what had been stored against this season and organized their cellars with the particular focused attention of someone who is looking at the arithmetic of survival and checking it twice. Wood was stacked and restacked, counted, calculated against anticipated need. Kerosene was measured. Salt was inventoried. The community turned inward in the way that communities in hard climates always turn inward in winter. The social radius shrinking from the whole valley to the neighboring homesteads, to the single household. The world growing smaller and more concentrated as the cold tightened its hold on the space between people. Maren Halverson's world had already contracted to what mattered. In these early weeks of winter, the tunnel revealed its first dividend in the currency that she had most needed to save time. The daily rhythm of her life had been reorganized around a simple fact that no one from the outside could see, and that she had not announced to anyone. The journey to the barn, which had previously required the full theater of winter preparation, the layering of wool and leather, and the winding of scarves, the pulling on of heavy boots, the psychological steeling required before opening a door into the killing cold, the rope line gripped in both hands, the slow and exhausting crossing through. Whatever the weather was doing that day, that journey had become a walk through the earth. She would open the cellar door, take her lantern from its hook, and descend. The temperature in the passage was what it had always been, what it would always be, what the Earth had decided it would be, and had been maintaining since approximately the time of the last ice age. Cool enough that she could see her breath in a faint cloud in the lantern light. Cool enough that she wore a shawl. Not cold enough to hurt. Not cold enough to require the negotiation between will and suffering that last winter's crossings had demanded. She walked the 100 feet of tunnel in less than 2 minutes. She emerged in the barn. She did her chores. She came back. The whole operation took perhaps 40 minutes, beginning to end on a morning when nothing required special attention. Last winter, the same operation had required 2 hours and had left her exhausted and half frozen and in need of recovery time before she could do the next necessary thing. The difference projected across a winter of 120 days, each requiring 2 barn visits per day, was staggering. She was reclaiming hours of her life every single day. Hours that went instead toward cooking, toward mending, toward reading with Oscar in the evenings, toward the quieter kinds of work that winter permitted, toward rest. Rest. In a Montana winter homestead, a resource so scarce that it barely had a name in the vocabulary of pioneer survival. And she was accumulating it like savings. Her wood consumption was the other visible sign of something different operating in her cabin, though it was visible only to her, and only in the private accounting of her woodpile. The small iron stove required 1 or 2 logs in the morning to raise the temperature of the cabin to comfortable, and another few in the evening if the night was particularly cold. The rest of the time, the cabin maintained a temperature that was livable without active heating. This was the tunnel working, the warm and moisture-laden air from the barn, from the continuous metabolic furnace of Blossom and the 2 goats, and even the minimal contribution of the chickens, moved through the passage by the slow and reliable physics of convection. Warm air rising at the barn end, cool air settling toward the cabin end, the differential creating a gentle and unceasing circulation that surrendered its thermal content to the stone walls of the passage and received it back in the moderated and steady form of a tunnel that never dropped below the ambient temperature of the surrounding earth. The stone walls charged overnight with the heat of the animals and discharged it slowly through the day. The earth above the tunnel insulated the exchange from the worst of the outdoor cold. The cabin sat at the end of this system and received air that arrived already raised from the lethal temperatures outside to something that her small stove could push the rest of the way to livable with minimal fuel. She was not warm the way Gideon Calloway was warm, with his great roaring fireplace and his mountain of hardwood and his radiant bubble of heat that extended 4 feet from the hearth and no further. She was warm the way the earth is warm evenly and everywhere, a steady and pervasive temperature that asked nothing dramatic of anyone. She noticed in late November that her woodpile had declined by approximately 1/5. At this rate, it would last well into March. She had calculated when she was stacking it in September that it represented about 2/3 of what she thought she would need on an ordinary plan. She had been worried about this. She was no longer worried about this. December came. The cold deepened. But the storms were minor, manageable, the kind of weather that a prepared homestead handled without drama. The valley went about its business in the reduced, focused way of winter. The men who had occasion to pass by the Halverson place saw what they always saw, a modest cabin smoke from the chimney, a woman going about her necessary work. What they did not see was the quality of that smoke, which was thin and intermittent rather than the thick, continuous column of a household burning through its fuel against the cold. What they did not see was the door in the floor of her root cellar, or the tunnel behind it, or the way she moved through her winter days with a pace and an ease that had no business existing in a single woman's homestead at this latitude in December. The community's interest in the widow's folly had by this point faded into the background noise of collective memory, filed away as one of those eccentric episodes that occur in small communities and are remembered with gentle amusement long after the person involved has either proven right or failed in ways that required quiet assistance. The assumption in most of the households that had formed and expressed an opinion was that Marin had failed, not dramatically, not in any way that would require immediate intervention or charity, but failed in the sense that the tunnel, whatever she had actually managed to complete of it before winter closed down the work, was probably full of snow and useless, and she was probably managing on her rope line like everyone else. And she had spent a summer's worth of good preparation time on a project that had taught her an expensive lesson. No one asked her directly. She did not volunteer. Oscar, for his part, had adapted to the tunnel with the complete and uncritical acceptance of a 6-year-old for whom the new thing is simply the way things are. He did not compare it to last winter, which he remembered as a long series of anxious nights in a cold cabin, waiting for his mother to come back from the barn. He accepted the tunnel the way he accepted the creek and the mountains and the fact that chickens were fundamentally unreasonable. It was part of the world he lived in. He liked the way his lantern made shadows move on the stone walls. He liked the coolness and the silence. He liked emerging in the barn where Blossom was always there, always placid, always smelling of hay and warmth. He named the tunnel. He called it the Underground Road, and he asked his mother one evening whether there were other underground roads in other places leading to other barns. She told him about the mines. She told him about his father, who had understood the underground roads better than anyone she had ever known, who had spent his working life in the earth and had loved it the way some men love the sea, with a respect built on intimate knowledge of its power. She told Oscar that December evening by the stove, with the wind doing its early work outside, and the tunnel doing its quiet work below their feet, about the diagrams in his father's journals. She explained the principle in the language of a 6-year-old, which is not so different from the language of truth. The earth remembers the summer, she told him. When it is cold outside, the earth keeps the summer's warmth inside it down deep where the cold cannot reach. Your father knew this. He wrote it down so we would know it too. Oscar considered this with the seriousness he brought to important questions. Is the summer still there? He asked. Under us right now. Right under our feet, she said. He looked at the floor with new interest. Then he went back to his soldiers. The journals occupied her evenings increasingly as December deepened. Not the technical sections which she had worked through thoroughly during the building. She had moved deeper into the observational parts, The sections where Edvard recorded not calculations but perceptions, the things he noticed and wondered about during his long days in the earth. He wrote about the way sound traveled differently underground, the way time felt different, the way a man's sense of direction, so reliable on the surface, became unreliable underground, where there was no sun to orient by, and the landmarks were all internal. He wrote about the miners he worked alongside, most of them men who had come to the territory from somewhere else, from failed farms or exhausted mines in other parts of the country. Men with histories that had not worked out the way they planned, and who had arrived in Montana by a process of elimination rather than intention. He wrote about them with a generosity and an attention that surprised her rereading it now. She had known he was observant. She had not remembered how deeply he cared about the people he observed. There was a passage in the middle of the November journal from 3 years earlier that she had not remembered reading. She found it on an evening in mid-December, when the wind outside had acquired a new note, a lower register than the ordinary winter wind, a sound that she had learned to attend to. He had written about a conversation with an old miner named Voss, who had been working underground in various countries for 40 years and who had the particular knowledge of a person whose survival has depended on paying the right kind of attention to the right kind of signs. Voss had told Edvard that the earth spoke, that if you worked in it long enough and listened with enough patience, you could learn its language, which was a language without words, but not without meaning. Edvard had written about this observation carefully and precisely. He meant Edvard wrote that the earth communicates through pressure and temperature and moisture and sound. A man who has spent 40 years underground has learned to read these signals the way a sailor reads the sky, or a farmer reads the look of the clouds on a July evening. Not mystically, precisely. The earth has a language. Most people have simply never stayed still long enough to learn it. She read this passage twice. Then she set the journal down and looked at the floor of her cabin and listened. The wind outside, the creak of a timber settling, the faint, slow sound of the stove breathing, and below all of that, below the threshold of ordinary listening, the deep and patient silence of the earth, which was not silence at all if you attended to it long enough. It was the sound of the deep ground holding its temperature, the sound of summer held in suspension 4 feet below the frost line waiting. She had built the project that Edvard had designed. She had done it alone with inadequate tools and the assistance of a 6-year-old, and the particular kind of determination that is not bravery, because bravery implies a moment of decision, a choice made in the face of fear. This had not been that. This had been the slow daily application of a truth she had come to believe as deeply as she believed anything. A truth that her body now knew the way her body knew how to walk without the necessity of argument or conscious verification. She had been told she was wrong. She had been told by the most experienced and respected man in the valley that she was making a mistake that would cost her dearly. She had been told by the accumulated opinion of a community that knew these winters better than she did, that had survived them for longer than she had, that she was spending herself on a dead man's dream. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings, not with resentment, with something more like curiosity. She wondered what Calloway would have needed to see in those conversations in August and September to have arrived at a different conclusion. She did not think he was stupid. She did not think he was malicious. She thought he was a man whose success had taught him what worked, and whose survival had depended on trusting that knowledge, and for whom the suggestion that a proven approach might be incomplete was not just an intellectual challenge, but a kind of personal threat. That was the difficulty with the surface world and its surface logic. The surface logic was not wrong exactly. A big fire and a large woodpile and a rope line between the buildings, these things worked. They had kept people alive for as long as people had been trying to winter in places like this. The fault in the surface logic was not that it was false. It was that it was the only logic available to people who never went deep, who never understood that the world extended below the surface in directions that completely changed the nature of the problem. Edvard had gone deep, literally and otherwise. She had, through the work of building this thing, gone deep too. She turned another page in his journal. January arrived the way a magistrate arrives in a courtroom, without announcement, without warmth, with the simple, enormous authority of its office, and the total indifference to appeal that power of sufficient magnitude always possesses. The temperature in the first week of January dropped to levels that made December feel moderate in retrospect. The creek froze solid across its entire width for the first time in 2 years. The cattle in the valley's various barns pressed together for warmth and breathed in clouds of steam that condensed and froze on the barn walls above them in long gray streaks. The horses stood with their backs to the wind and their heads low and their hides rough with cold, despite their heavy winter coats. The valley was quiet, with the particular quiet of extreme cold, which suppresses sound, the way it suppresses everything else, replacing the ordinary ambience of a working landscape with a crystalline and total silence, broken only by the sound of contraction of wood and metal and frozen earth adjusting to temperatures they had not expected and did not welcome. Marin's days had a shape that she had not had to impose on them, but that had emerged naturally from the rhythm of what needed to be done and the ease with which she could do it. She rose before first light. She built a small fire in the stove more for the cooking than for the warmth, since the cabin was already at a temperature that required only minor adjustment. She made porridge. She woke Oscar and fed him. She descended to the tunnel and crossed to the barn, did the morning chores, returned with whatever the morning had produced in the way of milk or eggs. She spent the middle part of the day on the indoor work of winter, the mending and the repair, and the slow, careful work of reading and thinking and the making of things that hands could make in a confined space. She crossed to the barn again in the late afternoon. She returned. She fed Oscar. She sat by the stove in the evening with a journal or a book. She was not thriving by any external measure. She was not prosperous. Her cabin was small and her supplies were sufficient but not generous, and her boy needed boots that were a size too large for him now, and would need new ones in the spring. But she was not afraid. That was the thing she had not expected. That was the dividend she had not calculated when she was marking out the stakes and driving them into the August ground. She had calculated warmth and fuel efficiency and animal survival, She had not calculated what it would feel like to go into a Montana January without the specific grinding daily fear that had defined last winter, the fear that was not dramatic or acute, but was simply always present. A background noise of danger that wore at a person the way a persistent sound wears at the inner ear. She was not afraid now. She was watchful. She was respectful of what winter was capable of. She was not complacent in any of the ways that complacency kills people in hard climates, but she was not afraid. She had placed herself in right relationship with the physics of her situation, and the physics were holding. Then, the sky changed. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January. She had come up from the barn with the milk pail and was standing in the yard for a moment in the cold, watching the eastern ridge for the first light of the sun, which had become a small daily ritual. A moment of acknowledgement of paying attention to the day before the day fully arrived. The sky to the north was wrong. It was the kind of wrong that has no specific detail you can point to, no single visible element that you can identify as the cause of the unease. It was a tone, a quality of the light, or rather of the absence of light. A darkening in the northern quadrant of the sky that was not the ordinary dark of a winter morning, but something else, something with depth to it, something that was coming. She had seen this sky once before, not in Montana. In Norway as a child, on a day when her father had called her inside from play with a particular urgency in his voice, and had not explained why, had simply said, "Come inside now," and closed the shutters and built up the fire. And 3 hours later, the worst storm of the decade had hit the coast, and the boats that had been in the harbor were gone. She looked at the northern sky for a long moment. She went inside and woke Oscar and told him that today he would not go out to play in the yard. He accepted this with the mild protest of a child who has learned that his mother's instructions, however inconvenient, are generally issued for reasons that become apparent. She spent the morning in additional preparation. She brought extra wood inside, stacking it against the wall near the stove in quantities that exceeded what she expected to need. Because the wood was here, and she could bring it, and the cost of being wrong about the weather was small, while the cost of being right without having prepared was large. She checked the tunnel entrance, the door in the cellar floor confirming it opened and closed cleanly, without obstruction. She went through the tunnel once and checked the barn, making sure the animals had full water and extra hay, and that the barn's own door was properly secured against the kind of wind that tears hinges from wood. She returned and made a large pot of bean soup and kept it at the back of the stove, where it would stay warm without attention. By noon, the northern sky had become a statement. By 2 in the afternoon, it was a wall. The temperature, which had been cold in the ordinary January sense, dropped with a speed that was less like weather and more like a physical event. A transformation of the environment as rapid and as total as if someone had opened a valve and was draining the warmth out of the world through a hole in the bottom of the sky. 30 degrees in the morning, 20, then 10. Then, below zero and still falling, the thermometer she kept nailed to the outside of the north wall of the cabin, reading numbers she had seen before, but never this fast. never this committed. The wind announced itself from the north with a low and building frequency, the sound of something large in motion, something that had no obstacle between it and this valley, except the mountains which would slow it, but not stop it, which would shape it and focus it and send it down the passes in concentrated streams of killing velocity. Then the snow, not falling, flying, horizontal and blinding and absolute. In 7 minutes, the world outside her window ceased to exist. She could see the glass of the window, and she could see approximately 6 inches beyond it. Beyond that was white, not the white of snow as she had previously understood snow, the white of a substance that was neither solid nor liquid nor gas, but some fourth state of matter that combined the worst properties of all three, that was dense enough to block all vision, fluid enough to penetrate every gap in every structure, cold enough to kill a person in minutes. She stood at the window for a moment and watched. Then she turned away. She had nothing to do at the window. Everything she needed she either already had or could get through the tunnel. The storm could do what it intended to do out there. Her job was to be here, and to be warm, and to be calm. She sat down near the stove and opened Edvard's journal to a page she had marked and began to read. Oscar was on the floor with his soldiers. He had expanded the campaign since November. The mountains were now built from potatoes and a collection of smooth stones from the creek and the river had been extended with a second strip of cloth, blue on one side and brown on the other, which allowed it to represent different rivers depending on the strategic situation. The storm hit the north wall of the cabin with a sound like a blow, not a gust. A continuous pressure, a sustained impact, the voice of something that had decided to be here and intended to stay. The candle flame on the table moved, just slightly. A brief lean to the south and then a recovery to vertical. Then it was still again. She watched the flame. It stood straight. Outside, the wind was doing what it had done to every structure in its path, and would continue doing to every structure in the valley for as long as it chose. It was finding the seams. It was finding the gaps. It was insinuating itself through every infinitesimal space between log and frame and glass, using the pressure differential that a wind of this speed creates to push cold air into any space that warm air occupied. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and a roaring wind creates a partial one everywhere in its path. In Gideon Calloway's house, 1 mile to the north and east across the valley floor, this process was already advanced. She knew this the way she knew things about physics that she had learned from Edvard's journals, not by direct observation, but by the necessary inference of someone who understood the system. The great fireplace in Calloway's house was doing what great fireplaces do in extreme wind events. It was consuming enormous quantities of air to feed its combustion, and sending that air along with essentially all of the fire's heat straight up the chimney and into the storm. The updraft created a low-pressure zone in the room that the wind was filling through every crack in the walls. Every log on the fire was making the house colder. She thought about this with something that was not satisfaction. It was too serious for satisfaction. People were in that house, Children were in that house. What she felt was something closer to sorrow. The sorrow of understanding a preventable thing and not having been able to prevent it, because the people involved were not yet ready to understand it along with you. There was nothing she could do about it now. She went to the stove and added a single log, not because the cabin needed it urgently, but because the act of tending the fire was the domestic ritual that connected her to the long chain of women who had kept fires and kept children, and kept households alive through hard times in difficult places. She made tea. She brought Oscar his cup with extra honey in it and sat cross-legged on the floor beside him and asked him to explain the campaign, which he did at considerable length and with the strategic seriousness of a general briefing a senior officer. The storm raged around the cabin like an argument that had nothing to do with them. On the first morning of the storm, which arrived without the ordinary ceremony of a sunrise, the sky simply shifting from black to a slightly lighter shade of white, she descended to the tunnel and crossed to the barn. The animals were fine. The barn was cold, but not dangerously cold, the water trough having a thin skim of ice that she broke with a tap, and that the continuing metabolism of the animals would prevent from reforming for several hours. Blossom was placid and warm to the touch. The goats were aggrieved in their general way. The chickens were roosting in a manner that suggested they had decided the storm was a personal insult and intended to respond by ignoring it entirely. She milked the cow. She distributed hay. She spent 20 minutes in the barn, in the earthy warmth of the animals, listening to the storm hitting the barn walls from outside with a force that shook the structure slightly on every major gust, feeling the absolute security of being below and inside and connected to the earth in the way that the tunnel had made possible. She returned to the cabin. She heated the milk. She served Oscar his breakfast. The storm continued. It was on the second day that she thought about Calloway's cattle. She thought about them with a specific and technical grief, because she understood what was happening to them, and she understood why, and she understood that the why was not cruelty or negligence, but simply the failure of a worldview to account for the physics of its own situation. Calloway had built a good barn. It was better than her barn in almost every measurable external way, larger and more solidly constructed, and stocked with more feed. But it was a barn without a connection to the thermal mass of the earth. It was a barn on top of the ground, exposed to the full thermal exchange, with an atmosphere that was now running at 30 below zero and dropping. The animals in that barn were producing their heat continuously, faithfully, at the same rate they always produced it. But the barn was not sealed. The wind was finding the gaps. The heat was escaping at a rate that exceeded the animals' production by a margin that increased with every degree the outside temperature fell. At 30 below zero in a wind of this speed, the inside of an ordinary barn, no matter how well built, will eventually approach the outside temperature if the external conditions continue long enough. She did not know how many of his cattle would survive. She knew some would not. She sat with this knowledge, and it was not comfortable, and she did not try to make it comfortable by telling herself that there was nothing she could have done. Because the fact was that she had tried to do something back in August, when she had begun to tell the people around her about the principle she was applying, and the something she had tried to do had been refused not with argument, but with the higher authority of social certainty, of the received wisdom of the substantial and the successful. The fire in her small stove held its log. The candle flame stood straight outside the blizzard that would be named for the children it caught in the open, committed its second full day to the erasure of the world. She taught Oscar a game with stones on the second day of the storm, a Norwegian game her mother had taught her that required counting and pattern making and a mild competitive spirit that Oscar possessed in abundance. They played for 2 hours. He won once. She won twice. He demanded a rematch and she granted it, and he won again, and was deeply satisfied by this outcome. She read to him in the afternoon from the storybook about the boy who traveled with the troll across the mountains of Norway and discovered that the troll was not what he had assumed, that the monstrous was not always what it appeared from the outside, that the thing you feared most in the dark often turned out, when you finally got close enough to see it, clearly to be something you could understand and even respect. Oscar was asleep before the end of the story. She sat in the chair and listened to the storm. It was on the second night, in the small hours before the false dawn, that she allowed herself to think about what would happen when the storm ended. She did not think about it in a planning way as a series of decisions to be made. She thought about it the way you think about things in the time between sleeping and waking, without direction, allowing the thoughts to arrange themselves according to their own logic. She thought about her neighbors. She thought about the families she knew in the valley, the women she traded information and occasional help with, the children who played with Oscar on the rare occasions when the social world of winter permitted such things. She thought about what the storm would have done to them, varying by the quality of their preparation and the luck of their location, and the particular vulnerability of their livestock, and the size of their wood supplies. She thought about Calloway. She thought about him not with satisfaction, not with vindication, but with the clear-eyed assessment that was all she ever brought to complex situations. He was a man who had been wrong about something important. He had been wrong in a way that had probably cost him significantly. The question of what he would do with that, of what any person does when reality delivers an unambiguous verdict against a deeply held belief, was a question she had no answer to. Some people she knew simply reinterpreted the evidence. They found a way to explain the outcome that left the worldview intact. The cattle died because the storm was exceptional. The barn could not have been built any better. No one could have predicted this. The narrative was adjusted. The lesson was avoided and the world continued as before. Other people looked at the evidence and let it do what evidence is supposed to do, which is change you. She did not know which kind of man Gideon Calloway was. She had formed an opinion of him, but opinions formed in the presence of certainty and good weather were not reliable guides to how a person behaved when certainty was removed, and the weather had been catastrophic. On the third day, the storm began to exhaust itself. The wind, which had sustained its peak intensity for nearly 60 hours, dropped not gradually, but in stages, as if releasing a grip hand over hand, each stage of released pressure, followed by a brief resurgence, a final insistence before the next easing. By midday, the visibility had extended to 50 feet. By late afternoon, 100. By evening, the northern sky had a quality that she recognized from Norway. A particular translucent blue that appears after great storms when the air has been scoured clean and the temperature has dropped past the point where any moisture remains, and the world is reduced to its essential geometry, the line of the horizon, the shapes of the hills, the angles of the structures that have survived. She stood at the window and looked at it. She felt the specific tiredness of 3 days of being indoors with a 6-year-old, and a small stove, and a storm that was not her adversary, but that had occupied all the space that surrounded her life for 72 hours. She felt the specific hunger for open air and distance that accumulates in confined people, the desire to see a horizon again. She was also simply tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with activity, and everything to do with the sustained low-grade alertness of someone who has been in a situation that required monitoring even when nothing was happening, who has been paying attention to the pressure of the walls and the candle flame and the sound of the wind without being consciously aware of doing so. On the 4th morning, she opened the cabin door. The world had been remade. Snow had accumulated in depths she had not seen in her years in this valley. The drifts against the north side of the cabin reached the eaves in accumulated sculpture of wind-formed white that had buried the cabin to half its height, in a monument to the storm's sustained industry. The yard between the cabin and the barn, which she had seen as open ground for 3 years, no longer existed as a concept. It was a continuous surface of wind-shaped white, some sections scoured nearly to the frozen earth below, others built into sweeping drifts 4 and 5 feet deep, their surfaces carved into the aerodynamic contours of sustained and powerful wind. She looked at the yard and understood with a clarity that needed no elaboration what the crossing between cabin and barn would have meant without the tunnel. Even now in the aftermath, in the still and brilliant morning after the storm with the wind gone and the visibility infinite, the crossing would have been a serious undertaking. The drifts were chest-deep in places. Breaking through them would require substantial physical effort. In the height of the storm, with zero visibility and 60-mile winds and temperatures that had by her thermometer reached as low as 42 below zero, at some point during the second night, the crossing would have been unsurvivable. She looked at the yard for a moment. She breathed the cold, clean, scoured air. Then she went back inside and descended to the tunnel. She walked its length. The candle flame she carried burned straight in the still air of the passage. The temperature was exactly what it had been on the day she first walked it in November, not affected by what had happened on the surface above it, not aware in any physical sense that the world had tried to end and had been prevented. The earth had simply maintained what the earth maintains. Patient, enormous, reliable beyond human reckoning. She emerged in the barn. Blossom turned her head and blinked. The goats complained. The chickens shifted on their roosting bar and settled again. She looked at these animals and felt the particular depth of gratitude that is reserved for dependable things. The gratitude that has no theater in it, because it is too complete for theater. These animals had been warm. They had been fed. They had produced what they produced, and had been available to be tended because she could reach them without risking her life to do it. She milked the cow. She returned to the cabin. She had just poured the milk into the pot on the stove when she heard something outside, a sound that was not the wind because the wind was gone, a sound that was not the settling of a snow-laden structure because it had direction and intention. Footsteps. Heavy, irregular, labored. The footsteps of someone who was crossing very deep snow in a state of significant exhaustion. She moved to the window. A figure was coming across the yard, coming from the north and east from the direction of the Callaway Ranch. The figure was large and moved with the specific difficulty of a person who has been outdoors in extreme conditions for an extended period, whose body is managing the cold and the exertion simultaneously, and is falling behind in both efforts. He was alive. That was the first and most immediate fact. She had the door open before he reached it. He looked at her from behind a beard that had frozen solid during his crossing and had thawed slightly in the warmer air near the cabin, and was now a complicated topography of ice and dampness. His face was the face of a man who has crossed a distance that cost him more than he expected, and who has arrived somewhere he did not know he would find. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The warm air of the cabin received him the way the earth receives water, quietly without drama, simply taking in what had arrived. He stood in the middle of the room and his breath came in long, ragged pulls. The breathing of a man who had been pushing hard through deep snow for a significant distance. He looked at the room. He looked at the small, steady fire in the iron stove. He looked at Oscar, who had risen from the floor and was watching the large, frost-covered stranger with the frank and uncomplicated attention of a 6-year-old. He looked at the candle flame which was burning straight. Callaway was a man who had built his life on seeing things accurately, on reading the evidence of a situation and understanding what it meant. That capacity had not left him. It was perhaps the most durable thing he possessed, more durable even than his certainty which the storm had dismantled piece by piece over 3 days and 3 nights. He was seeing this room accurately. He was seeing what the temperature meant, what the candle meant, what the woodpile along the wall still substantially intact meant. He was seeing the evidence of a system that had worked through the worst storm in 30 years, and had worked not dramatically, not heroically, not by the expenditure of enormous effort and will, but simply quietly on the basis of physics. He looked at the door in the floor. He looked at the worn stone threshold, smoothed by the passage of feet. He looked at Marin. She had not moved from her position near the stove. She was watching him with an expression that he would think about for years afterward, trying to describe it to himself accurately. It was not triumph. He was certain it was not triumph. It was something more careful than that and more generous. It was the expression of a person who has endured being wrong and then turned out not to be wrong, and who understands both experiences well enough to hold them simultaneously without reducing either one. "My cattle," he said. His voice was rough with cold and with something else. "3 of them. I found them this morning." She did not say anything. The others are sick. The water froze. He paused. He looked at his large hands, which were still wrapped in the gloves he had worn for the crossing. The leather darkened with moisture. I could not reach them. For 3 days I could not reach them. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you something warm." He sat. She put the pot of bean soup which had been sitting at the back of the stove since the first morning of the storm on the hot part of the burner and added a log to the fire and poured water from the jug into the pan for tea. He sat in the chair and looked at the floor. After a moment, he looked up at her. The certainty that had been the defining quality of his face for as long as she had known him was gone. Not replaced by weakness, replaced by something more honest. The face of a person who is in the presence of an experience that has changed them and is not yet certain who they are on the other side of the change. "I told you," he said, "that you were making a mistake." "Yes, I was wrong." She brought him the soup and set it on the table and sat down across from him with her own cup of tea and waited. He looked at the bowl for a moment. Then he looked at the door in the floor again. "How?" he said. The single word carried everything. The whole winter's worth of demolished certainty. The 3 days and 3 nights in the drafty house with the tyrannical fireplace. The frozen cattle. The fear on his children's faces. The moment he had opened his barn door on the 4th morning and found what he found. How did you keep them warm? How did any of this work? She looked at him across the table. She thought about August. She thought about the day he had sat on his horse above her trench and delivered his verdict, and the words he had used, and the way he had not dismounted, and the particular quality of authority that assumed it did not need to come down to the level of the thing it was judging. She thought about Edvard's journal, and the margin note and the long weeks of work in the clay, and the rock and the blisters and the aching back and the small wooden cart full of stones that Oscar had pulled back and forth across the yard all summer. She got up. She went to the corner where the wooden chest sat. She opened it and took out the journal and brought it to the table and set it open in front of him. Turned to the page with the diagram, the cross-section sketch, the parallel lines of the tunnel, the annotations in Edvard's careful hand, the Norwegian words and the English technical terms. She placed her finger on the margin note. "The earth does not forget the summer," she said. "My husband wrote that." Calloway looked down at the page. He looked at it for a long time. Outside the world that the storm had made lay in its brilliant and remade stillness the snow-covered valley catching the thin winter light and throwing it back in every direction, dazzling and cold and quiet, in the way that only follows something enormous that has finally exhausted itself. Inside the small cabin of Maren Halvorsen, the air was still. The candle flame was straight. The soup steamed gently in its bowl. And Gideon Calloway, the most substantial man in Granite County, sat across from the widow he had publicly called a fool and looked at the diagram of the thing she had built alone in the earth below his feet. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Show me." She lit the lantern. It was a simple gesture, The lifting of the glass chimney and the striking of a match and the lowering of the flame to the wick. A gesture she had performed 10,000 times in her life, and that had never before carried the weight it carried now. She lifted the lantern from its hook by the cellar door, and she looked at Gideon Calloway, who was standing in the middle of her cabin with soup in him, and some of the color returned to his face, and an expression she had not seen on him before, the expression of a man who has set down something very heavy and is not yet certain what to do with his hands. "Come," she said. She opened the door in the floor. The cellar steps were stone worn smooth by 2 winters of use, wide enough for one person at a time. She descended first, holding the lantern, and he followed her, his large frame requiring a slight sideways negotiation of the opening. His boots finding the steps carefully in the lantern light. The cellar received them with its characteristic cool and earthy silence. It smelled of the root vegetables stored along the north wall, the last of the autumn's harvest, and of the damp stone and the deep ground. Calloway stood upright in the cellar and looked around it with the assessing eye of a man who had built things and knew what he was looking at. Then she opened the second door, the one cut into the back wall of the cellar, the one that had not been there 2 winters ago, the one behind which the tunnel began. She stepped through. He followed. The passage closed around them both. The lantern threw its circle of amber light on the stone walls, on the careful dry stack construction of the lining on the flat stone floor that Marin and Oscar had set piece by piece through the long weeks of August and September. The ceiling was low enough that Calloway had to bring his chin down slightly, his hat brushing the timber above at the highest sections. The walls were close. 3 feet of space between them, enough for a person moving with purpose, enough for 2 people walking single file. He ran his hand along the stone as they walked. She heard him do it. She did not need to look back. She could hear the sound of his bare palm moving along the surface of the wall, the slight catch of skin on rough stone. And she knew what he was feeling because she had felt it herself, the first time she had walked this passage after it was complete. The temperature of the stone, the deep, constant, patient temperature of earth that had absorbed the summer's heat and was releasing it now in the slow and reliable way of things that operate on geological timescales rather than human ones. Not a single degree colder than it had been in November. Not a single degree warmer. Simply itself. Simply the temperature of the earth at this depth, in this place at this latitude. The temperature it had held through the entire violence of the blizzard above, through 30 below zero and 40 below zero. And the wind that had driven the cold horizontally across the surface of the world for 72 hours. None of that had happened down here. They walked the 100 feet in silence. She emerged in the barn first and stood aside to let him come through. He stepped up from the tunnel entrance into the earthen floor of the pen and straightened to his full height and looked around. Blossom regarded him with the mild and evaluative attention that she gave to anything new in her environment. A brief assessment, followed by the conclusion that he was not a threat and did not appear to have additional hay, and therefore could be returned to the category of background phenomena while she continued her primary occupation of existing warmly. The barn was cold. He would have noted that immediately. It was not warm in any way that would register as comfortable to a human being standing in it, but it was not the cold of a space that had been exposed to 40 below zero for 3 days. It was the cold of a space that had been insulated from the worst of that cold by the continuous heat production of the animals within it, and the sealed connection to the underground passage that ran from its foundation to the root cellar of the cabin, maintaining through the simple and irrefutable physics of thermal mass and geothermal stability, a temperature that the surface of the world had been completely unable to achieve. The water in the trough had a thin skin of ice on its surface, not a solid block, not the bucket-shattering mass he had found in his own barn that morning. A thin skin, the suggestion of ice, the minimum possible expression of the cold that existed outside these walls, held at that minimum by the system operating below and around them. He stood and looked at the trough for a long moment. She said nothing. He turned and looked at the stone-lined mouth of the tunnel entrance, which was set into the base of the barn's foundation wall. He looked at the quality of the construction, the careful selection and placement of each stone, the precise angles of the dry stack lining. He was a man who had built things. He understood, looking at this, the amount of work it represented. He had watched her building it. He had watched and had ridden over and had delivered his verdict and ridden away. She could see him thinking about this. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he was looking at the tunnel entrance with something that was not just comprehension, but reckoning, the specific kind of reckoning that a person does when they are accounting for the distance between what they believed and what is actually true. The animals kept it warm, he said. Not a question. Their heat goes into the passage, she said. The stone holds it. The cabin at the other end receives air that the ground has already moderated. My stove only needs to do the last part of the work. He was quiet for a moment. And the earth itself. The earth below the frost line holds a constant temperature year-round. Edvard measured it. He worked in the mines for years, and he measured it precisely. In this part of Montana, at sufficient depth, the ground holds between 45 and 50 degrees regardless of the season. Calloway looked at the floor of the barn. The earthen floor compacted and cold under his boots, but cold only at the surface. Below the surface, below the reach of the frost, the planet continued its patient arithmetic. The earth does not forget the summer, he said, quoting the words she had pointed to on the journal page. No, she said, it does not. He turned and looked at her across the dim and earthy space of the barn in the lantern light, with Blossom watching them both and the goats making their periodic contributions to the ambience. Gideon Calloway had come to Montana Territory as a young man with strong hands and clear ideas, and the particular confidence of someone who has looked at a difficult thing and believed correctly that he was capable of it. He had built what he built over 4 decades of effort and calculation, and the willingness to work at the limits of what a person could endure. He had been right about enough things consistently enough, for long enough that rightness had become less a conclusion he arrived at, and more a quality he assumed a property of his perspective rather than a result of his reasoning. He understood standing in this barn that this assumption had been wrong, not wrong about everything. His methods had worked. His approach had kept people alive, and his ranch prosperous through decades of Montana winters that would have destroyed less prepared operations. But wrong in the specific and important sense that the category of right things was larger than the category of things he knew, and that the things he did not know could kill cattle, and could under marginally different circumstances have killed children. He had been wrong. He had been publicly, loudly, categorically wrong. He had been wrong in the way that a person is most thoroughly wrong, when they bring the full weight of their authority to bear on an incorrect conclusion. He stood with this for a moment. It was not a comfortable thing to stand with, but he was beneath everything a man who had built his life on seeing things accurately, and what he was seeing now required him to stand with it regardless of its comfort. "Show me the rest of it," he said. "The principle, how it circulates, how the heat moves through the passage, all of it." They walked back through the tunnel. She carried the lantern and explained as they went, pointing to the features of the construction, the angle of the floor, the thickness of the stone lining in sections where she had calculated the greatest thermal exchange would occur, the way the passage narrowed slightly near the cabin end to increase the velocity of the air moving through it. She used Edvard's words where his words were precise, and her own where his were too technical, finding the language that converted principle into comprehension. He asked questions, good questions, the questions of someone who builds things and is now trying to understand a system that operates by principles he has not previously used, but that are not. He is discovering beyond his understanding. They came up through the cellar and into the cabin. Oscar was still on the floor with his soldiers. He looked up at Calloway with the frank interest of a child, and then looked back at his campaign. Calloway barely registered this because he was still working through what he had just seen and felt, and understood the process of integration that happens when a significant new truth meets an established worldview, and the worldview, after initial resistance, begins to incorporate it. She put more water on for tea, and set the journal on the table between them and opened it to the section where Edvard had worked through the thermal calculations. She turned pages slowly, pointing to the relevant diagrams explaining the annotations. Calloway leaned over the page and studied each diagram with the concentration of someone for whom diagrams have always been a primary language. He asked about the stone, the specific type and the thickness, and whether the type of stone mattered or whether it was primarily mass that determined the thermal storage capacity. She told him what Edvard's notes said and what her own observation had added to those notes. He asked about the angle of descent from the cabin to the barn, and whether it was deliberate, whether the slight grade served a function in directing the airflow. She told him it was deliberate. That warm air rising at the barn end and cool air settling at the cabin end created a slow convective loop that required the passage to be level or very slightly lower at the cabin end to function correctly. He was quiet for a moment after this. "I have a larger barn," he said. "Twice the size, more animals." He paused. "More heat to capture." "Yes," she said. "And my house sits closer to the hill on the north side. The gradient would work naturally. The terrain would help," she agreed. He looked at the diagram. He looked at it with the specific focus of a man who is already building the thing in his mind, who is already measuring and calculating and adjusting the design to the specific conditions of his own property, who has crossed the threshold from comprehension to application with the efficiency of someone who has spent his life solving practical problems. She watched this happen. She did not rush it. She did not add to it. She let the principle do its own work the way the earth did its own work, by simply being present and reliable and available to be understood by anyone who was willing to go deep enough. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way he said everything, directly and without excess. But there was something in the directness that was different from the directness of August and September, when his certainty had given his words a quality of finality of closed doors. This directness was open. It arrived without the weight of authority and was the more honest for its lightness. "You told me I was digging my own grave," Marin said. "I did. You said the consequences would be mine to bear." "I did." A silence. "You were working from what you knew," she said. "Your knowledge had kept people alive. It was not foolish to trust it." He looked at her steadily. "It was foolish to assume it was complete," he said. "I confused the limits of my experience for the limits of what was possible. That is a different kind of foolishness, and it is mine." She nodded once. It was enough. The accounting was done. What came after was more important than the accounting. She turned the journal to the page with the full system diagram and set it flat between them on the table. And they spent the next 2 hours working through the application of the principle to the specific geography and architecture of the Callaway Ranch. She answered his questions from Edvard's notes and from her own experience of building and operating the system through the winter. He asked and listened and asked again, building his understanding layer by layer with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that the structures worth trusting were the ones built without shortcuts. Outside, the valley lay in its post-storm stillness. The sky, which had been a wall of white for 3 days, was now the particular transparent blue of extreme cold and perfect clarity. The sun moved through it in its low January arc, throwing long shadows across the sculpted snowfield that had been the valley floor. Every building in the county bore the evidence of what had happened. The north-facing drifts piled to roof lines. The south-facing surfaces nearly bare. Where the wind had scoured them, the whole landscape reorganized by 72 hours of sustained violence into a new and unfamiliar topography. The silence after the blizzard was its own kind of presence. It had the quality of aftermath of the specific quiet that follows something enormous. The quiet in which a person takes stock. People were doing that across the valley, in the homes that had managed the storm, and in the homes that had been managed by it. The immediate work of survival was giving way to the assessment of damage and the calculation of what had been lost and what could be recovered. Men were digging out from their drifts and making the crossings to their barns and finding what 3 days of the worst blizzard in 30 years had done to animals they could not reach, and water they could not break, and temperatures that no ordinary preparation had been designed to withstand. The losses were not uniform. Some farms had done well enough. Others had lost livestock. A few had lost more than that. The valley would spend the rest of that winter and the whole of the spring comparing notes on what had worked and what had not, conducting the informal post-mortem that frontier communities always conducted after events of this magnitude. The collective processing of what had happened and why and what could be done differently. This conversation in the weeks and months that followed kept returning to the same point of reference. The Halverson place. It was Oscar who started it in the way that children start things, by simply reporting what they observe, without the filtering mechanism of adult social calculation. He had told other children who had told their parents about the underground road, about how his mother had walked to the barn and back every day of the storm, without going outside, about how the cow had been warm, and the water had not been frozen, and the soup had been on the stove the whole time. And they had played soldiers and stone games and read stories by a candle that never once flickered. Children's accounts are not technically reliable, but they carry a specific emotional accuracy that adult accounts sometimes lack. The other children understood from Oscar's description that the Halverson cabin had been a place of safety during the storm, a place where normal life had continued in some meaningful sense, while the blizzard tried its best outside. They communicated this understanding to their parents in the unfiltered way of children, and the parents, who had their own reasons to think carefully about what they had just survived, listened. Word moved through the valley in the way that important things move through small communities, through the natural channels of people who see each other at the mill and the store and the church, and who talk because talking is how a community processes its experience. But it was Calloway's account that settled the matter. He was not a man given to excess of speech. He was not a man who told stories in the enthusiastic and elaborated way of a natural storyteller. He was a man who stated facts in the sequence that made their logic visible and left the listener to draw the conclusion. When Gideon Calloway described what he had found at the Halverson place on the morning after the blizzard, when he described the warm air, the burning candle, the child on the floor, the intact woodpile, the living animals in the connected barn, the thin skin of ice on the water trough, instead of the solid block he had found in his own, and when he described the underground passage and the principle by which it operated, the people listening to him heard it differently than they might have heard it from anyone else. They heard it as testimony from the most skeptical possible witness. They heard it as the account of a man who had publicly opposed the project and had been converted not by argument but by evidence, by the unambiguous verdict of the worst storm in 30 years, and who was now stating what he had seen and what it meant with the same directness he brought to everything. The widow's folly was no longer called the widow's folly. It was in the tentative and exploratory way of communities trying on a new idea, beginning to be called the Halverson system. The first week of February brought a cold snap that was not the violence of January's blizzard, but that was serious and sustained a long week of temperatures in the 20s below that tested every structure in the valley and found again the division between the preparations that had been sufficient and the preparations that had not. Maren noticed nothing different in the first week of February than she had noticed in December or January. The tunnel maintained its temperature. The animals maintained their warmth. The cabin maintained its livability. The small iron stove consumed its modest and predictable ration of wood. The candle burned straight. She had begun in the evenings after Oscar was asleep to write, not in the way that Edvard had written in the precise and technical language of an engineer annotating his own reasoning. She wrote in the plain and observational way that came naturally to her, the way she had always thought, by describing what she saw, and what it meant and how one thing connected to another. She wrote about the construction of the tunnel, the specific decisions she had made, and why the places where Edvard's design had required adaptation to the actual conditions of the actual Earth she was moving through. She wrote about what had worked and what she would do differently in a second iteration. She was not writing for publication. She was writing because the knowledge felt too important and too hard-won to exist only in her own head and in the pages of a dead man's journal. It needed to be in a form that could be given to someone else, copied out, handed over a fence, set on a table in front of a man who had just survived the worst blizzard in 30 years and was asking how. She wrote carefully in the evenings by the lantern light, while the winter held the world in its grip outside, and the tunnel held the summer in its own grip below. In the second week of February, Calloway came back. He came with his eldest son, a young man of 20 who had the same broad build as his father, and the same direct manner, but not yet the same certainty. Not yet the certainty that his father was in the process of revising. He came with a notebook and a pencil, and the specific focused attention of a person who has decided to learn something. She sat with them both at her table for 3 hours. She went through everything: the selection of the route, the depth calculations, the stone sourcing, the construction sequence, the roofing method, the seeding of the mound, the connection to the existing root cellar, the management of airflow, the maintenance requirements which were minimal, the expected performance in conditions of various severity. She answered questions. She showed them Edvard's original diagrams and the notes she had written in the evenings, which had by this point grown to a dozen pages, and constituted something approaching a construction guide for a person who understood the basic principles and wanted to apply them to a specific property. The young man copied everything into his notebook with the careful efficiency of someone who has been told this is important and has believed it. Calloway listened and occasionally asked a question, and mostly sat with the particular stillness of a man who is paying the deepest possible attention. The stillness that is not inactivity, but its opposite. The intense internal activity of someone integrating new information into existing understanding, finding the places where it fits and the places where it requires the existing understanding to shift. When they left, the young man had 30 pages of notes, and Calloway had something that did not fit in a notebook. He had, she thought, watching them go across the snow-covered yard. The thing that Edvard had always said was more valuable than information. He had the principle, the underlying truth from which specific applications could be derived and adjusted and improved for any particular situation. He had the reason that the thing worked, not just the instructions for how to build it. And that difference was the difference between copying a solution and understanding it deeply enough to generate new solutions of your own. March came with its false promises. The days lengthened visibly, and the sun strengthened to the point where the south-facing slopes showed their first tentative brown between the diminishing snow. And then a cold week in mid-March erased all of that progress and reasserted winter's authority for another 3 weeks, before finally, in the first days of April, the grip released. The creek found its voice again. The birds returned in their sequence, each species arriving in its appointed order, as if consulting a shared calendar. The mud season came, which in Montana is its own form of adversity. The ground releasing the winter's moisture in a slow and comprehensive saturation that made every path a negotiation and every field a question about whether a wagon could cross it without sinking past redemption. Spring in Montana was not a gentle thing. It was an argument between the departing cold and the arriving warmth, conducted over weeks each day. A different verdict, the outcome uncertain until it was suddenly one morning no longer uncertain, and the world was green. When the ground was workable, Calloway began to dig. He had spent the months since February in the planning that preceded the work, the surveying of his property, the identification of the optimal route between his main house and his large barn, the calculation of depths and materials, the sourcing of the stone that would line the passage. He had consulted with Marin twice more before the ground froze hard again in February, and once more in late March, as the thaw began refining his understanding of the technical requirements. He dug with his 2 sons and 2 hired hands. The tools were better than what Marin had worked with alone. The crew was larger. The scale was more ambitious, his passage running 180 feet and connecting not just to the main barn, but to the separate structure where he housed his best horses. But the principle was the same. The earth does not forget the summer. He sent one of his sons to her with a question in the 3rd week of the project. A question about the angle of a section of the passage where the terrain created a slight rise that complicated the gradient she had described as ideal for natural convection. The son arrived at her cabin with the question written in the notebook, and she answered it from Edvard's principles, explaining the physics of why the gradient mattered and what alternative approaches were available when the ideal gradient was not achievable. She sent her answer back with the sun, written out carefully in the plain language she had been developing in the evening pages. The question arrived from others as the spring progressed, not all at once, not in a formal delegation, in the organic and informal way that information moves in a community that has been shaken by a shared experience and is collectively trying to understand what it has learned. A neighbor asking over a fence, a woman at the store inquiring quietly while the men were talking about something else, a farmer from the north end of the valley who had lost 4 cattle in the blizzard and had been thinking about it all winter, and had heard enough about the Halverson system to want to understand it before the summer preparation season began. She answered everyone who asked. She shared the written pages freely, allowing them to be copied and passed on. She walked the properties of 3 different neighbors and helped them identify the optimal route for a passage given their specific terrain and building placement, applying Edvard's principles to the particular conditions of their land the way she had applied them to her own. She was not seeking this role. She had not set out to teach. She had set out to survive, and the method she had devised for surviving had turned out to be a truth large enough to be useful to other people. And the other people had found their way to her door, and she had answered them because the knowledge was not hers to withhold. It had been Edvard's knowledge to begin with. She was only its translator. There was an evening in late May when she walked the length of the tunnel alone without a lantern to see what it was like in the dark. She wanted to experience it the way the air experienced it, without the mediation of light, purely as the physics of the thing. It was dark in the absolute and total way of underground places. She moved through it with her hand trailing along the stone wall, the coolness of the stone against her palm, her footsteps quiet on the flat stone floor. She moved slowly, not from fear, but from attention, from the desire to feel each detail of the passage without the distraction of sight. The air was exactly what it was, still, smelling of earth and stone and faintly from the barn end of hay and the warm exhalation of animals. She stood in the middle of the passage, equidistant from both ends. The dark was absolute. The temperature was exactly what it had been in January and what it would be in August, and what it would be next January if she built nothing else and changed nothing and simply allowed the earth to go on being what it had always been. She stood there for a while. She thought about the day she had driven the first stake. She thought about the feeling of that August morning, the dew on the grass, and the mountains going pink in the early light, and the particular quality of a decision that has been made fully accepted completely, that no longer carries the trembling of uncertainty, because the uncertainty has been consumed by the act of beginning. She thought about Edvard's hands drawing these diagrams, the specific angle he held his pen, which she had watched 1,000 times and could still see precisely when she chose to. The way he would pause in the middle of a calculation and look at the ceiling for a moment, following a thread of reasoning to its conclusion, before writing it down. The way he would sometimes read a particularly elegant result aloud to himself in Norwegian, not for her benefit but for his own, because some truths were worth speaking in the language in which you first learned to think. The earth does not forget the summer. He had been right about that. He had been right about the physics and the principle and the design and the application. She had enacted his rightness with her own hands in the soil of the homestead. They had come to together, and the enactment had been true, had been proven true by the most unambiguous test available. And now the truth was spreading outward through the valley in the organic way of useful things from person to person, adapted and applied and improved as it moved. He had not lived to see it. She stood with this for a moment in the dark of the tunnel. She did not try to make it something other than what it was, which was grief without resolution. The kind of grief that does not diminish with time, but changes its character, moves from the acute to the chronic, becomes less a wound and more a weather, a permanent condition of the atmosphere of a life. She would have given all of it to have him back. She would have given the tunnel, and the surviving animals, and the proved principle, and the community's hard-won understanding, all of it, without hesitation, to have Edvard sitting at the table in the evening with his pen and his journal, and his particular way of looking at the ceiling when a thought required its proper ending. But she could not have that. and the tunnel was real and the winter had been survived, and Oscar was alive and healthy and 6 years old and deeply committed to the ongoing military campaign of his wooden soldiers. And the knowledge was spreading and the valley was better prepared for what the next winter would bring than it had been for the last one. These things were also real. She put her hand flat against the stone wall in the dark. She felt the temperature. The steady, patient geological temperature of the earth in this place. At this depth, the temperature that the summer had deposited here, and that the winter had been unable to retrieve. She stood like that for a while. Then she turned and walked one hand on the wall toward the faint and distant suggestion of light. That was the cabin end of the passage. Toward Oscar and the stove and the evening routine and the wooden soldiers who would need to be briefed on the day's strategic developments before being set aside for sleep. She climbed up through the cellar and into the kitchen. She stood for a moment with her hand on the cellar door, feeling the ordinary air of the cabin, which was warmer than the passage and smelled of the evening meal, and the particular combination of soap and wool and wood smoke. That was the smell of this life, this specific life she was living. Then she let the door close and went to the stove to start the soup. The first tunnel, built in direct imitation of the Halvorson system, was completed on the Callaway Ranch in June of that year. Callaway and his sons dug it in 6 weeks using the notes from the winter sessions with Marin and the written pages she had given them, and the practical experience of men who knew how to work and who were working now from understanding rather than from doubt. The passage ran 180 feet from the foundation of the main house to the large cattle barn. It was lined with the abundant flat stone that the Callaway property provided, set with the careful attention to thermal mass that the principle required. It was roofed with timbers salvaged from 2 outbuildings that had collapsed in the winter blizzard and no longer served their original purpose, covered with hides, and then with the excavated earth seeded with grass sealed against the weather. At the barn end, a secondary branch, shorter and simpler, extended to the horse enclosure. Callaway stood at the barn end of the completed passage on the afternoon of its finishing, his hands on his hips, looking back along the length of it toward the house. His eldest son stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "It's a sound piece of work," the son said finally. "It is," Callaway agreed. He looked at the tunnel entrance, the stone-lined opening in the base of the barn foundation. He thought about the woman who had built one like it, smaller and alone with a child's help and a shovel, and the drawings of a dead man she had believed in. He thought about August, the horse, the height from which he had looked down. "When I go to tell Mrs. Halvorson it's done," he said, "I'll go on foot." His son looked at him. "She'll want to see it," Callaway said simply. She came the next morning, walking the 2 miles to the Callaway Ranch in the early summer air, with Oscar ranging ahead of her and behind her in the way of children who have been given open space and cannot commit to a single direction. The mountains were clear and close-looking in the summer light, the way they always looked when the air was clean and the sky was high and the grass along the road verge was tall and green and full of the insects that would feed the birds that were feeding their young in the nests hidden in every hedgerow and fence post and eave. She walked the Callaway tunnel from the house end to the barn end. She examined the stone setting with the informed attention of someone who had done this work and knew what to look for. She checked the angles, the thickness of the lining, the quality of the roofing, the integration with the existing structures at both ends. It was good work. It was in some respects better work than her own. He had more resources and more hands, and he had learned from her experience in ways that allowed him to avoid the adjustments she had made in the middle of construction, to build the optimal design, rather than the design that evolved toward optimal through trial and correction. She told him this. She told him it was sound, and that the thermal mass was well calculated, and that the gradient was correctly managed in the section where his eldest son had sent the written question, and she had answered it. He accepted this with a nod. "The stone is well set," she added. Edvard would have said that was the most important part to get right. Calloway looked at her. "Tell me more about what he wrote," he said. "Not just the technical parts, the rest of it." They sat on the bench outside the barn in the June morning, and she told him about Edvard's journals, about the breadth of his thinking, about the way he understood the earth as a living system, rather than as raw material, about Voss, the old miner, and the language of the earth, about the note in the margin. That was not a technical specification, but a way of seeing. Calloway listened the way he had learned to listen this winter, with the full and open attention of someone who knows they are hearing something important. That summer, 3 more passages were begun in the valley, then 4 more the following summer. After the community had lived through another winter with the first wave of completed tunnels demonstrating the principle under real conditions, confirming what the Halvorsen place had demonstrated and what the Calloway Ranch had extended, and adding the weight of multiple confirmations to a truth that no longer required a single woman's stubborn faith to keep it standing. The passages were adapted and modified as they spread. The builders of the valley were practical people with practical minds, and they brought to the Halvorsen system the same inventive pragmatism they brought to every other problem of frontier life, testing variations, comparing results, sharing findings in the informal and continuous way of people who understand that the knowledge most worth having is the knowledge that actually works. Some built their passages wider to accommodate the movement of equipment as well as people. Some integrated small storage chambers at intervals along the route, using the constant temperature of the passage to maintain the quality of preserved food over winter, in ways their root cellars had never quite achieved. One family on the south side of the valley, whose terrain did not permit a direct connection between house and barn, built a modified system that used a buried cistern of water as the primary thermal mass, the water absorbing and releasing heat more efficiently than stone at certain temperature differentials. Edvard would have found this last adaptation particularly interesting. Maren thought when she heard about it that she could see exactly where in his journals he would have added a note about it, precisely which diagram he would have modified to incorporate the new data. The practice of the thing, the ongoing, living, correcting, improving practice of a principle that was true. The passages came to be called in the valley's common speech Halvorsen passages, not because anyone made a formal decision about this, because that was what people called them when they talked about them, the way things get named in communities by the accumulated weight of ordinary usage. By the gradual coalescence of many small acts of attribution into a convention that everyone eventually simply accepts. Maren heard this term used for the first time in the store in town on an autumn afternoon when she had come in for supplies, and two men she did not know were discussing the construction project. One of them was undertaking and referred without looking at her to the Halvorsen method. She was quiet for a moment. She bought her supplies. She went home and walked to the tunnel entrance in the yard and looked at the low, grass-covered mound that ran between the cabin and the barn. Now fully established, the prairie grass, having taken firm hold through the summer, and sealed the structure beneath it in a seamless and organic integration with the surrounding landscape. You could not see it if you did not know to look. Which was, she thought, exactly right. The best systems are invisible in their operation. They do not announce themselves. They do not require attention or maintenance or the dramatic expenditure of will. They work because they are correctly understood and correctly built, because they operate by the actual principles of the actual world, rather than by the principles that seem correct from the comfortable distance of the surface. Edvard had understood this. She had enacted it. The valley was learning it. Oscar came out of the cabin behind her, banging the door in the way of children who were thinking about something other than the door, and came to stand beside her in the autumn afternoon. He was 7 now a year from when this had all begun. He looked at the grass-covered mound with the familiarity of someone for whom this thing has always been part of the landscape, for whom its presence requires no explanation, and its absence would be the thing requiring comment. "Is the summer still there?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked in December, sitting on the floor with his soldiers. She looked at the mound. She thought about the earth below it, the stone walls of the passage, the steady depth temperature that no storm had touched and no season had altered. "It's always there," she said. He nodded once satisfied and went back inside. She stood for a moment longer in the autumn light, with the mountains going amber above the tree line, and the first suggestion of the coming season in the sharpness of the air. And she felt the thing she had felt on the morning she finished the tunnel, and looked at what she had built, and understood that it was real. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter and more lasting than either of those. The knowledge that she had listened to the right voice when the louder voices were telling her not to. That she had gone down when everything above ground was urging her to build higher. That she had trusted what was below the surface of things when the surface had offered her nothing but resistance and ridicule. That she had finished what Edvard had begun. The autumn deepened around her. The first snow would come within the month, and the tunnel would do what the tunnel did, and the winter would do what winter in Montana always did, and none of what winter could do would reach the thing she had built in the earth below the frost line. The earth did not forget the summer. She had not forgotten it either. She turned and walked back to the cabin into the warmth of the evening and the smell of soup on the stove, and the sound of Oscar explaining to his soldiers the revised strategic situation. And she closed the door behind her against the coming cold, and the tunnel below her feet went on doing its quiet and endless work.